Hey, good afternoon. Wanted to come back and hit you guys with another story time from my adventures um, working in, I guess you could say, corporate America. I guess you could say Septa is kind of like corporate. And I want to tell you about this experience I had about racism. So, my life started off pretty early being introduced to racism growing up in South Philly, being as though, like back then, the neighborhoods were kind of like separated. It was like segregation. You had the black neighborhoods, you had the Irish neighborhoods, you had the Polish neighborhood, you had the Italian neighborhoods. So anytime you wanted to move around, you had to kind of like interact with these different groups. And back then, they were distinct groups. They weren't one big group like they are now. And that's a whole nother story time on why they kind of like did that. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like um, they have a common foe or a common enemy, and that would be us. But anyway, so I was introduced to that racism stuff kind of early on in life. And so I've been experiencing it over my years. You know, I went to high school in New Jersey. So I experienced, walking down the hallways being called the N word and stuff like that. I experienced it in college when I went and they actually had to shut the school down for 3 days so that we can have these in service days about racism because somebody wrote some article in the college newspaper. Um, so anyway, fast forward to when I come to Septa, the first thing I noticed when I came through the door at Southern was the fact that it was basically segregated. You had tables of white folks and you had tables of black folks, and they kind of like had their little um, separate tables, even though they would like gamble together and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it was separate tables, and so that was one of the first things that I noticed. And I, experienced racism out on the bus, being called the N word and things like that. More so like if you left somebody or something like that. What I started to do is pick away from lines that were predominantly, um, I'll just say, not in black neighborhoods because I didn't want to be bothered with that kind of stuff. So coming into management, it might have been within like the first month of me being a manager. This is supposed to be like kind of like the higher level of a company. This first level manager. So what happened was we used to have meetings back then. We would sit at the table. The AD or the assistant director chief would come in and he would tell us about what's going on for the day, ask us any questions, and then we'd go out the street. Well, right before I became a manager, we had three promotions to the AD level. And some of the supervisors, non-white supervisors, decided that they were not too happy about the choices of who got promoted. They looked at these guys kind of like they were stupid. They didn't know the job because they hadn't been managers that long. So they kind of like looked down on them. So in protest, what they did was they wouldn't sit at the table. What they would do is they would stand in the back of the room, and then it was kind of like their way of like not submitting to the chief. So in this particular day, the chief is black, and I could hear him coming down the hallway. I could hear his keys hitting his pants as he was coming down. So you knew he was getting close. And you could hear his footsteps because everybody was quiet. And these guys were kind of like, I'm facing the door. They were behind me. And I could hear him coming down the hallway. And when he turns and he goes through the door, he stops and he's like in shock. You get to see like in his face, like he was kind of like, didn't know what to say or what to do. So when I turned around, these three guys, they were kind of like, anyway, these three guys were standing there and they had Ku Klux Klan hats on. Ku Klux Klan hats, homemade, that they made at home. So the chief kind of laughed it off, and he went and he, laughed it off and he went and sat down. And the reason why I didn't like make a big deal about it is because it would have brought the chief into it also, because he had, from my understanding, what he did was he had shown them a cartoon of this Ku Klux Klan member in a hospital with all black nurses and doctors around him. And um, it says something like, "You're effed," right? So that's what he did. And this was their response. But to think that they went home and they're like, all right, we're going to get them, we're going to get them. I mean, they probably spent all day the day before thinking about what they want to do. And somebody said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make some Klan hats. And we're going to wear them at the job. So that was my first experience. And then most of the racism that happens in these companies is subtle. You see people get promoted that you're like, what's that about? And it's kind of like this behind the scenes unwritten rule, and we're just supposed to accept it. You go along with the program because you don't want to be the one to speak out and say anything about it. But the kicker was, I mean, that was bad. But the kicker for me, and knowing that it was really time for me to go, was when the person they hired as the director, he literally, and I'll tell you, to be honest with you, I've said this publicly, even to his boss. There's no way that you could convince me that this guy out interviewed the people who didn't get the job, because they had been doing the job basically. Now I don't want to use their names because it's not it's not their video, but they were basically in conjunction with the previous director, basically running the department. They knew everything, payroll, all that stuff. They were going to the meetings. They were setting up basically everything for the department. And this guy, all he did was detours. So there's no way this wasn't a racist move by the person who kind of like put this in motion. And that would be, his last name begins with an L. You figure it out. But when he left, he basically dropped a grenade in our department, because once this person got the job, it's been going downhill ever since. And nowhere, I don't remember ever hearing about supervisors quitting, like just resign and go do some hustles on the side. Where you have assistant directors that retire on the first day that they're eligible. This has never happened before in the history of Septa. And they allow this stuff to go on because they have to protect their own, and I get it. You're supposed to look out for your people, but at the expense of what? And I got a million stories to tell of like how goofy this place was. And it's just sad, because at the end of the day, it's the people that suffer. So now you have 3 ADs that left within 7 months. And the people that are left just don't have the experience and the know-how to really understand the ins and outs and know how all this thing is done. And if they don't get the training that they need, which they won't, because I could tell you another story about how they cut my training from, I was in charge of training for the department. They cut it down from 3 months to 6 weeks. So obviously they're not, they don't value training and education. And you can kind of see it in the finished product. So even after, when I was getting ready to leave and people would be asking me questions, oh, they don't know this or they don't know. Yeah, well, what do you expect me to teach them in 6 weeks that I used to teach them in 3 months? So all those scenarios in cases that we talked about, couldn't go over it, didn't have the time. So I gave them a curriculum of what they kind of like had to have, and that was that. And even with the 6 weeks, the director looked at it like, man, I rode around with 2 weeks. I rode around for 2 weeks with another supervisor, and I went out and shoot on my own. And he thinks that's acceptable because he got by. But I remember being in a car with him when I first started, myself and another TM, and they gave a code 66 on the radio. He was like, what's a 66? What the hell's a 66? They using a 66 on the radio. 66 an accident. He didn't even know what an accident was. So his 2 weeks of training and then his experience of being an AD, he still didn't know. And Giordano was pissed. Like, shut the hell up. Don't show these guys how stupid you are. This is exactly what he said. Shut your mouth. Don't show these guys how stupid you are. So this is what is kind of like ruining the company. You know, hiring people from the outside that don't have a clue. You know what I mean? Hiring from people from different departments that don't understand supervision with no training, just give them the keys and like, all right, go to work. So this is why you get what you get. Meanwhile, I'm out here enjoying my retirement and just thankful that I don't have to deal with that crap anymore, you know? And more story times coming. But I'm going to get away from talking about Septa at some point. I just have to get it out of my system. And, you know, it is what it is. This is kind of like my venting for myself and some of my coworkers, especially the ones that can't speak for themselves. And that's why I talk about it. Anyway, have a nice day.